Hey, Pastor Susie. For my reflections from the book of Mark, I'm focusing largely on the topic of authority. Now, I'm not just focusing on authority as the topic in general, I'm focusing more so on one specific aspect of authority, as authority covers the entire book of Mark, from Jesus' teachings to his healings to um, his messages and parables. But one thing that I wanted to focus on specifically from his teachings on authority was the fact that we question his authority and our own authority that he's given us. This first example is found in Mark 4:38, when Jesus and his disciples are on the Sea of Galilee, and when there's a storm that comes and hits their boat, the disciples are terrified. I mean, they question their authority right in the immediate moment. But Jesus is asleep on the boat, not worrying about a single thing. When the disciples go down to wake him up, they're saying, "Why aren't you concerned for our well being?" Jesus gets up and immediately rebukes the storm, and he commands it to go away. Now, you would think that the disciples would understand this, as they've been with him for a while at this point, but they still question his authority. It isn't until later in the book of Mark, in Mark 14, when the disciples start asking Jesus what they need to do for him, instead of actually questioning his authority and saying, "What are you going to do? You can't do anything." Um, I wondered why they quit questioning his authority, for that matter. And I see the Sanhedrin, who constantly questioned Jesus' authority throughout his ministry until his crucifixion and resurrection. But then I thought to one particular story, and it was from Mark 9, and we're going to start in verse 14 and then work our way to verse 23, reading out of the New King James Version. "And when he came to the disciples," this is after the transfiguration on the mount, "and when he came to the disciples, he saw a great multitude around them, and scribes disputing with them. Immediately, when they saw him, all the people were greatly amazed, and running to him, and greeted him. And he asked the scribes, 'What are you discussing with them?' Then one of the crowd answered and said, 'Teacher, I brought you my son, who has a mute spirit. And wherever it seizes him, it throws him down. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. So I spoke to your disciples that they should cast it out, but they could not.' He answered him and said, 'O faithless generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I bear with you? Bring him to me.' Then they brought him to him, and when he saw him, immediately the spirit convulsed him, and he fell on the ground and wallowed, foaming at the mouth. So he asked his father, 'How long has this been happening to him?' And he said, 'From childhood. And often he has thrown him both into the fire, into the water, to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us.' Jesus said to him, 'If you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes.'" And then later on in this passage, Jesus goes on to heal the boy of his possession, that demon possessed situation. And this is one of those instances where Jesus is questioned and his authority specifically is in question. But Jesus immediately rebukes it, knowing his sonship and his identity. And I believe we have the same authority in our world today. But for us today, we also see that we question our authority on a daily basis, and Jesus rebukes that. But why would he rebuke it? And that's one thing that really ran around in my mind over the course of studying Mark. Then I realized, after reading Matthew 4, why Jesus rebukes that spirit of questioning the authority that he's granted us and the authority that he has. And in Matthew 4, 5, and 7, it's when Jesus is in the desert being tempted by the devil. And in these three verses, the devil looks at Jesus and says, "If you are the Son of God, then turn these stones into bread." Well, Jesus says, "If I am," he said, "I know I am. I know my place and I know my authority. Why would I have to prove something through a sign to be able to just carry it out?" I mean, of course God's going to work signs and wonders, but at this point it's testing God. And Jesus explicitly lays out right there in those three verses that to test God is basically demonic. And that's one thing that we have to be careful about as believers, knowing our authority, knowing that we don't have to test God, knowing that we have already been granted the victory and that we're going to carry it out in the way that he has for us. So that is my big reflection from Mark, and I can't wait to see what Acts has in store. Hope to see you sometime soon, possibly the next class. Have a good night.